All right, so I'm going to give you a scenario that most writers experience at some point. And so I just want you to think about whether it's ever happened to you, and if it did, just kind of think about that experience. Have you ever done this thing where you have a scene in mind? It can be anything. It can be an action scene, it can be a romance scene, it can be the scene where everything changes for the character. It's just something that you have in mind that you think is awesome. And maybe you even build the story around that scene. Maybe it's the first scene that you come up with and you're writing toward it. I'm sure this has happened to most of you because most of us do this. We come up with a particular concept or, a little snippet of the story in our head, and we cannot wait to get to the point where we can write that because it's like what we're waiting for in the story. It's what we're waiting to get to. And, often we have many of those throughout the story. Well, there's just one problem. Especially early on when we're new authors, we have that scene in our head and we start writing toward it, but we may not, be quite skilled enough to reverse engineer from that scene, which means that by the time we reach it, things are really different. Maybe the story we've created along the way doesn't actually match up with that scene anymore. Maybe it's going to feel really strange to drop that scene in. Maybe the characters are acting differently than would make sense in the scene that you originally envisioned in your mind. Okay. So that's the scenario that I kind of want to talk about today. Has that ever happened to you? Like I said, it's happened to most people. It has most definitely happened to me. So we're going to talk about what to do if you find yourself in that situation. And here's a little spoiler, you don't have to cut that scene, not entirely, okay? So there are things you can do to still save that scene that you first felt really passionate about, and that's what we're going to talk about today, so stay tuned for that.
Hi there, aspiring fiction author. Welcome to Fiction Author Business School. Do you want to write your stories with ease and confidence? Do you find yourself Googling how to write a fiction book or how to write a character arc? Do you want to create a fiction empire, but you can't even finish the story you're currently working on, and you find yourself doubting it will even be good enough? Hi, I'm Liesl. I too have been writing stories since I was just a kid. I wanted to do something about my fiction writing dreams, but got information overload every time I looked for writing help because there's just so much out there on the internet. I wanted confidence that I wouldn't disappoint my readers and a plan to publish regularly. I knew the foundation of any author career, including the marketing aspect, is a stellar and well-written story, but I didn't know how to be sure that my story was solid. I went on a journey to figure out what really makes readers tick and how to incorporate those addictive elements into my story. In this podcast, you'll find specific tactical fiction writing tips, solutions to writing more words more efficiently, and secrets to mastering your author mindset. So, put on your fuzzy slippers, grab a notebook and pen and some chocolate, and let's write some fiction.
Okay, like I said, this has happened to me before. It's actually happened lots of times. I was trying to think of what books I've written that this has happened in, and I think it's happened in all of them at least once, at least to some extent, whether it was with a big scene or a small scene or, whatever the case may be. I remember particularly when writing The Botanist, it happened a couple of times. I would put in a scene and I would get this feedback from my group saying, we're not sure that really fits. We're not sure that the character would really react that way. If you're going to do that, then you need to go back and change previous scenes so that it matches up, that sort of thing. And first of all, let's just talk about that. It's okay if that scene doesn't match up. It's not anything to be super depressed about. It's not anything to, really tear your hair out about. I mean, take a moment and be grateful for the scene you had in your head. Whether you end up using it or not, it is the scene that got y'all fired up and got y'all passionate about the story and that helped you create this story. It's what got you here. So even if you can't use it anymore, that's okay. It's still what got you here, and it's still okay to love that scene in your head. Maybe you'll use it in another story if you can't use it in this story, right? The other thing, so really when you find yourself in this situation, there's two different things that you could possibly do. And it's simply that you can cut the scene and do something else, or you can find some way to use the scene. Okay. So I'm going to talk about finding ways to use the scene. That's the point of this podcast episode, but let's just give a quick nod to cutting the scene. It's okay if you want to do that. If you really feel like it's not serving your story and it's not a scene you want to include, you don't have to feel guilty about not including it, okay? Like I said, it is the thing that got you all fired up and got the story written and going in your mind, but that doesn't mean you have to keep that scene if it's just not serving you or your story anymore, okay? However, if you love that scene and you're really, really kind of bummed to have to cut it, there are things that you can do. Contrary to popular belief, you don't actually have to cut a scene that no longer works, okay? I told you that this happened with me on The Botanist, and I ended up rewriting the scene. I kept a lot of the things that I originally loved from it, and I just sort of changed it a little bit so that it fit a little bit better the story that I had written up to that point. And I was pleasantly surprised because the group that I had at the time, they had an intense emotional reaction to the scene that I came up with, and it worked very, very well. Okay, so my point is, even though I didn't use the exact scene that I had originally envisioned, I still used most of the elements that I loved from that scene. So you don't have to cut it 100%. You can just tailor it to what you've already written. And let me tell you guys, countless people have done this. I mean, there's probably more authors who have done this than have not. I'm not going to pretend that I know most of them or that they have told me their stories or anything, but it's just about making sure that your scene fits with the rest of the story. So you may have to cut a few things, you may have to add a few things, you may have to build a few bridges. You know, if you did A and B in the scene before it, and now you want to do C, you're going to have to make sure that they line up, you know. So it might mean a little extra work. It might mean writing an extra scene or writing an extra transition or something like that. But you can do it. And here's the thing. Here's the really beautiful thing about this. Because you are marrying the passion that you had that first created that scene in your mind that you've been writing to, and the depth and grandeur of what you've already written in the story, doing this, changing it to line up with what you have written, it has the potential to be the best and most powerful scene in your entire book. So I'm going to encourage you, when you find yourself in this place, not to get discouraged about it and not to be depressed about it. I mean, don't take the negative tact for it, right? Think of it as a challenge. Think of it as, okay, I've written myself into a corner. This is where I am. This is where I want to be because I want the scene to work. How can I make it work? And honestly, that's a good approach to take for anything having to do with your writing and for life in general. Try not to, be the person that's all, woe is me, and, all my best laid plans are ruined because this is what I wanted. No, instead just say, okay, well, this is where I am. This is where I want to be. How can I make this work? And then you are putting on your most creative genius hat in order to figure that out. Okay. So the question is, if we're going to, or we need to change the scene a little bit in order to make it fit what we've already written, how do we do that? So I've got a few tips for you. You might want to take out something to write on and something to write with. So the first thing you want to do is write down where the gaps are. So if the scene that you've been writing toward and that you really love doesn't fit with the story that you have written, then you need to ask yourself why. And you probably know inherently, but bring it front and center. Write it down. What exactly is the problem? Is it that the character is different? Is it that, what you've established about their beliefs and their reactions to things doesn't fit with what you had them doing in that scene? Or is it more of a logistical thing, where you are in the story, you can't figure out how to make it so that scene makes sense. Maybe they're across town. Maybe you need to figure out how to get them to the place they need to be in order to make it happen. Maybe their beliefs don't jive with what you have them doing in the scene. Maybe it's the dialogue. They would never say that in the scene, right? Just figure out what the gaps are, because you're not going to be able to fix them until you know what they are, and write them down. Write down everything that's a problem. And you might even want to get help with this. Sit down with a critique partner and explain things to them, and then just say, I feel like this isn't working. Can you tell me if it's working for you, why it isn't, why it's not, and get some outside feedback as well. So that was number one. Number two is that you're going to brainstorm how to bridge those gaps. Now, this might be a little bit of a writing exercise for you. Do what I always tell you to do. Relax your brain, do some free writing, do whatever it takes to really get the creative juices flowing for you. So whatever you do that always helps you figure out plot holes and things, whether it's going for a walk, cooking, taking a shower, whatever the case may be, or if it's just sitting down at your computer and letting the ideas flow, do that. Brainstorm some way to bridge those gaps. Come up with some really, really ridiculous ideas and then some not so ridiculous ideas and see what you come up with. Again, that's just the best way to really get things flowing, and you might be surprised at how well you can bridge those gaps and make the scene work. And you might even come up with something to add to the story that you didn't have before that makes it a lot better. All right. So the next thing to consider, number 3, is can you write some bridge scenes to make it happen? Now, again, it's going to depend on why the scene is not working with what you've already written. If it's just a matter of logistics and by logistics, I mean the plot. I need this person to be over here doing this for the scene, and instead they're over there doing that. Well, can you write some sort of bridge scene to get them where they need to go so that it works in the plot? If it's something that has to do more with the character, like their beliefs or their backstory or their dialogue or their personality, their reactions, well, that's a bigger thing, right? It's a little bit harder to fix. You could still write some bridge scenes in which maybe the character talks about why they might act out of character in a certain situation. Or you can write a scene where you come up with a belief that leads to their action in the scene. And if you put that earlier, then what they do, even if it's a little bit out of character, will make sense to the audience because you've set up for it, right? So think about that. You're just going to try to come up with a way to write some bridge scenes so that that scene that you love so much and want to include can happen and make sense. Number 4, consider using it as a repetitive theme for character building. So even if it doesn't have a whole lot to do with your plot, even if you feel like at this point it's coming out of left field, could you use it as something the character believes or says very often and use it repetitively throughout the novel so that when you actually have the scene, it fits in perfectly with who they are, even if it doesn't seem to have a whole lot to do with the rest of the story? Okay, that's something you can do too. Keep in mind that character quirks, things they say, things they do repetitively, they don't necessarily have to tie into the overall plot. That's just who this character is, right? So if you have someone all the time that says, I don't know, try to come up with an example on the fly. If you have a character that says like all the time, well, saying like is just a character quirk. It has nothing to do with the overall theme that you're going for necessarily, and you can certainly find ways to incorporate it so it does have to do with the overall theme, but I'm just saying you could take something from that scene that you love and incorporate it as more of a character quirk, and then that way when the scene comes along it doesn't feel out of place. Okay. Number 5 is just to look at the details. Maybe you don't have to change your book as a whole. You don't have to change the overarching theme or the overarching plot events. Maybe you can just figure it out in the details, and that's kind of what I've talked about, repetitive character quirk, that is a detail. Writing bridge scenes about maybe an extraneous belief they have that's going to come into play, that is a detail, okay? So keep in mind that I think part of the reason we get so depressed about this is we automatically say, oh, in order to make that scene work, I have to rewrite the entire novel. Most of us aren't willing to do that. And so we just go, oh, it just doesn't work anymore. And that's so tragic because I love that scene. But guys, you can make it work. Okay, that's why I say brainstorm. Get a piece of paper, write down all the ways that you could possibly make it work. And if you really want to make it work, you can make it work. And yes, you may have to change some elements of the scene. But so what? If you can keep the things you really loved about it and put it into your book will be that much better for it. Okay, so that's all I'm saying. The whole point of this podcast is something that me and one of my writer friends were talking about in our group last week, is just you don't have to cut a scene that no longer works for you, especially if it was a scene that you had a huge emotional reaction to. If it was something you built the story around, if it was something you were really passionate about, just refocus it, figure out how to make it fit into the story you already have, repurpose it a little bit, and you can still include it. And like I said before, because you're marrying your own passion for that scene with the beauty of the story you've already written, it has the potential to be the best scene in the entire book. So take it as a challenge to make it that, instead of just getting depressed and being like, oh, well, I guess I have to kill my darlings and cutting it. Now, again, nothing wrong with doing that either if you decide that that's what's best for your story, but you don't have to. If you love that scene, keep that scene. That's all I'm saying. Okay, so one more time, let's go over them. Number 1, write down what the gaps are. What exactly is the disconnect that's making it not work? Brainstorm lots of different ways to fill those gaps and try to understand the functional element here, guys. Is it the plot that's the problem? Is it the character that's the problem? Is it their belief that's the problem? Is it their backstory that's the problem? The more you understand about what's causing the problem, the easier it will be to fix, okay? Number 3, try to write some scenes to bridge the gap. See if you can make the scene work as is, just by writing a few extra scenes to make it so that it's not out of place. Number 4, consider using it as a repetitive character theme for character building, like a character quirk or a snippet of dialogue that they use a lot. And if you put it repetitively throughout the book, remember, repetition, it makes things make sense because they're part of a pattern. So it will not feel out of place if it's repeated. Okay. And finally, just look at the details, right? You don't necessarily have to change anything huge about the book or the story. You don't have to rewrite all the words or anything. Just see if you can figure it out in the details and keep the scene, or just change a few details. Sometimes it's just one tiny minor detail and your group can say, this makes no sense. And then you put in like a sentence and they're like, oh, now that makes perfect sense. Okay, it really can be that simple. It isn't always, but it can be. So keep that in mind. And overall, guys, just don't get depressed about this. I'm going to reiterate one more time. If you have to cut it, okay, then maybe that really is what's best for the story right now, but still feel gratitude for the fact that you had so much passion for that scene, and that scene is what created this story, the story that you are loving writing and that hopefully you're going to get published and make money off, and other readers are going to love it. Okay, just because you can't use that scene doesn't mean that it wasn't there for a purpose in your mind and in your heart to help create the story. But on the flip side, if you want to keep the scene, I am of the belief that anything you want to keep, you can keep it. Yes, you might have to do some extra work to make it work, to make it all jive, to make it continuous. But if you really want to keep that scene, there is a way that you can keep it. You just have to figure out what it is, okay? And these steps will help you do that. Lots of brainstorming, lots of writing things down, bring things front and center, okay? So instead of just letting them kind of nebulously float around in your mind, write them down, think about them very specifically. That's almost kind of like bringing it out of the subconscious and into the conscious so that you can deal with the problem. Try to figure out where the problem stems from. Again, is it the character? Is it the plot? The more you understand, the easier it will be to fix. And then, guys, do what you do best. Just start writing and figure out how to make it work, okay? Sometimes the best thing you can do is write yourself into a corner so that you are forcing yourself to figure a way out of it. And that will make you a better writer. It will make you more creative. It will make your stories better, and it will make readers love them all the more, okay? All right, so that is what I have for you today. Have a wonderful week of writing. Try to plug some of these in if there's a scene that you're struggling with. There are other scenes maybe that aren't ones you envisioned before, but you're still trying to find ways to make them fit, and these concepts can help you there too, okay? I would love to hear if you have any success with them and if they help you write any of your scenes. But until next time, just keep writing, keep putting out those wonderful stories, and remember, there is always a market for awesome. See you next time.
Thanks so much for listening today. Before you go, would you be willing to do me a solid? If you found any value at all in this episode today, would you be willing to share it with other authors just like you in the hopes that they might find some value in it as well? Happy story crafting this week. Remember, only you can bring the world the unique story that you are trying to tell. Only you can succeed in your own unique way in getting it out of your mind and your heart and into a medium where it can reach thousands, if not millions, of salivating readers. You don't have to worry about failure because there is always a market for awesome.